the man who dared to stand up against gynecologist Ursula von der Leyen. Prime Minister Viktor Orbán took the boldest step yet against Brussels. The conflict had been simmering for years. Now, Orbán openly confronted Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, accusing her of betraying her neutrality and instead acting as a political activist imposing her ideology. One sentence, and Europe shook. When Viktor Orbán publicly demanded the resignation of the European Commission president, it was not just a political act. It was a punch to the heart of the European Union's power. A taboo had been broken. An unwritten law had been trampled upon. No one was allowed to challenge the system from within. For years, Brussels had been accustomed to issuing orders, directives, sanctions, freezing money, labeling people as extremists, undemocratic, and dangerous. And the nations bowed their heads, remained silent, compromised. But this time, it was different. Orbán didn't whisper behind closed doors. He spoke directly to the public, accusing EU leaders of betraying their neutrality, transforming themselves into political machines imposing ideology. No evasion, no apology, no retreat. And at that very moment, the artificial order began to crack. For his supporters at home and across Europe, this was the ultimate act of defiance. A small nation daring to stand up against the most powerful office in the European Union. For his critics, it was a reckless confrontation, raising fears of escalating tensions and the risk of Hungary's isolation. Because the issue was never just Hungary. The issue was who had the power to decide the fate of nations. While Brussels saw itself as the guardian of values, millions of citizens felt something different. They were not consulted. They were not allowed to vote on decisions that directly affected their lives. And when they objected, they were labeled enemies of the European project. Orbán didn't just attack an individual. He tore apart the veil of the entire system. And when the veil was torn, what lay behind it was not as beautiful as it had been advertised. Let's look closely at how the system works. When a government complies, money flows. When a government resists, sanctions immediately follow. Orbán's move has transformed policy disagreements into a legitimacy crisis, where the question is no longer just about migration or money, but whether the EU's top leadership is capable of confronting the direct challenges from within. The origins of this confrontation date back more than a decade, linked to Hungary's role on the front lines of the European migration crisis. Since 2015, the Orbán government has described itself as Europe's shield, claiming to have prevented over 1 million illegal border crossings. Unlike many other member states that receive EU financial support for border protection costs, Hungary has largely borne the burden itself. From Budapest's perspective, this is absurd. While other countries are reimbursed for their costs, Hungary receives almost nothing but criticism. Orbán insists he acted not only in the national interest, but for the entire Schengen area, protecting Western Europe from uncontrolled migration. Hungary's demand for compensation is not just about money, but also about recognition. Orbán wants Brussels to acknowledge Hungary's role as a protector, not an outcast. He sees Hungary's border fence as a physical symbol of sovereignty and security, in line with the will of the Hungarian people. Conversely, from Brussels' perspective, Hungary's measures violated EU asylum law, particularly by denying migrants access to fair asylum procedures. This divergence of viewpoints has poisoned bilateral relations for years. The controversy escalated into open hostility when the European Court of Justice imposed one of the harshest penalties in EU history. Hungary had to pay a one-time fine of 200 million euros, plus 1 million euros per day until its migration and asylum system was aligned with EU law. The message was clear: either comply or be crushed. The elite called it the rule of law. But in the eyes of many citizens, it was political coercion disguised as morality. Decisions were made by unelected committees that had the power to stifle budgets, exert economic pressure, and shape national policy. Who benefited from this? Not the workers, not the families struggling with soaring prices, not the communities bearing the consequences of decisions they had never agreed to. It's a transnational elite, speaking the language of values, but acting by power. And this is when you need to ask yourself, if Hungary is punished today for defending its borders, tomorrow, which country will be the next target? If you're watching this video and it sounds familiar, if you've ever felt your voice ignored, hit like now. Not for this channel, but for yourself. Because silence is the fuel of the system. Orbán understands that. And whether you love or hate him, one thing is undeniable. He broke Brussels' monopoly on discourse. He turned a technical debate into a stark moral question. Who is serving whom? When leaders panic, they call it a threat to democracy. But history shows that every system calls its challenger a threat. And when punishments no longer inspire fear, the system begins to crumble from its very roots. The most dangerous thing for a system of power is not protest. It is precedent. In Orbán's narrative, the European Union has created a moral order that is turned upside down. Countries that defend their borders are punished, while those that open their doors are celebrated. While this wording may not fully reflect the legal complexities of EU asylum law, it carries immense political power. For Orbán's audience, this message reinforces the existing suspicion that Brussels cares more about ideology than about the security and will of its citizens. Hungary is portrayed as a victim, unfairly treated for doing the dirty work that other countries avoid. Today, it is Hungary. Tomorrow, it could be Italy, France, Germany, or any country where people begin to ask, why aren't we allowed to decide? Orbán has created a domino effect. No military, no violence. A simple, yet deadly message. Brussels is not unchallengeable. And that's when fear shifts sides. No longer the fear of small nations, but the fear of the system losing control of the narrative. Because when people realize that major decisions are made without their input, when they understand that values are merely an excuse to maintain power, obedience begins to crumble. The European Union was once marketed as a project for peace. But now, many see a punitive machine, a power structure not accountable to the vote. The final question is no longer, Orbán right or wrong, but who has the right to speak, and who is forced into silence? If the system is as strong as they claim, why are they afraid of a nation daring to say no? If you believe this debate isn't just a Hungarian issue, if you believe the power of decision rests with the people, not with closed-door meetings, please share this video. Not to support any individual, but to break the silence. Because the system only survives when we stop questioning it.